Some of the most powerful forms of manipulation never sound aggressive. There is no yelling, no obvious insult, no direct attack. Sometimes, the manipulation is silence, and that is what makes it so dangerous. Because when someone controls you without saying a word, your brain starts creating answers on its own. You begin analyzing everything, their tone, their distance, their delayed response, the silence after an argument, the silence after vulnerability, and slowly, without realizing it, you begin emotionally shrinking yourself just to restore connection. That is the terrifying part, because the manipulator never needed to scream. Your own nervous system started controlling you for them. And psychologically, this works far better than open aggression, because human beings are deeply uncomfortable with emotional uncertainty. Research shows the brain often experiences emotional rejection similarly to physical pain, which means silence is not emotionally neutral. To the nervous system, silence can feel like danger, especially when the silence feels intentional, and manipulative people understand this instinctively. Some people weaponize words, but emotionally skilled manipulators weaponize absence, a delayed message, a cold pause, a withdrawn presence, sudden emotional distance, and because nothing obvious happened, you start blaming yourself instead. That confusion is part of the control, because uncertainty creates obsession. Your brain begins searching desperately for emotional clarity. What did I do wrong? Why did they suddenly change? Should I apologize? Should I text again? And while you are mentally spiraling, the manipulator stays emotionally still. That imbalance creates psychological power, because the person chasing emotional resolution almost always becomes the emotionally dependent one. And this is where silent manipulation becomes dangerous. The victim often does not realize they are being controlled, because there is no obvious abuse, only emotional instability. One day the person feels warm and emotionally close. The next day they feel distant and unreachable. That inconsistency trains the nervous system to become hyper alert. You begin monitoring their mood constantly, watching facial expressions carefully, overthinking messages, feeling anxious when communication changes slightly, and eventually, your emotional state becomes dependent on their attention, not because you are weak, but because intermittent emotional reinforcement is psychologically addictive. When affection becomes inconsistent, the brain becomes more emotionally attached. That is why people often struggle to leave emotionally manipulative relationships, even when they recognize the pain. The nervous system becomes trapped between anxiety and relief, and silence becomes part of the conditioning process. This is why emotional manipulators often withdraw right after moments of closeness, right after vulnerability, right after emotional intimacy, because emotional withdrawal creates insecurity, and insecurity increases emotional dependence. The brain starts craving reconnection, and suddenly, you are no longer acting naturally. You are acting strategically to avoid emotional distance. You become more careful, more anxious, more self-monitoring. You rethink your words constantly. You apologize more often. You suppress your real emotions. And without realizing it, you slowly lose emotional freedom. That is what silent manipulation actually does. It changes your behavior without direct force. And psychologically, that is one of the strongest forms of control possible, because the manipulation begins happening inside your own mind. And maybe the darkest part is that many victims do not recognize the manipulation until much later, because silence looks harmless from the outside. There are no visible scars, only confusion, anxiety, emotional exhaustion. But manipulative silence rarely feels peaceful. Healthy silence feels calm. Manipulative silence feels emotionally heavy. You can feel the tension even without words, and your nervous system knows the difference before your mind fully understands it, which raises a disturbing psychological question. Why does silence affect the human brain so deeply? And why do manipulative people instinctively understand that uncertainty creates more control than aggression ever could? The human brain is designed to search for emotional certainty. That is why silence can become psychologically overwhelming. When communication suddenly changes, the brain treats the uncertainty like a problem that must be solved. And the more emotionally attached you are to someone, the stronger that reaction becomes. Because emotionally attached, people do not simply react to silence. They react to what the silence might mean. Maybe they are angry. Maybe they are losing interest. Maybe something changed. Maybe the relationship is ending. And while the mind searches for answers, the nervous system enters a state of emotional stress. Psychologists sometimes call this hypervigilance, a condition where the brain becomes highly alert to emotional danger. You begin scanning for signs constantly. Tiny changes in tone, small delays in messages, subtle emotional distance. And the frightening part is that manipulators often recognize this sensitivity very quickly, especially in empathetic people, because empathetic people naturally try to repair emotional tension. They overanalyze themselves before blaming others. So instead of questioning the manipulator, they question themselves. Maybe I am overreacting. Maybe I am too emotional. Maybe I caused this somehow. And that self-doubt creates even more emotional control, because confused people become easier to influence. This is why silent manipulation often creates emotional dependency without obvious force. The victim becomes psychologically trapped, trying to restore emotional balance, trying to fix the connection. And manipulators understand something most people do not. Human beings fear emotional loss more than emotional discomfort, which means uncertainty can become more powerful than direct conflict. Because conflict at least provides clarity. Silence provides imagination. And imagination is where anxiety grows. The brain starts filling empty space with fear. That is why emotionally manipulative people often avoid direct communication. Instead of honestly expressing anger, they withdraw emotionally. Instead of discussing problems, they create distance. Because emotional ambiguity gives them more psychological control. And over time, the victim slowly adapts their behavior around avoiding withdrawal. They become more agreeable, more emotionally careful, more afraid of upsetting the other person. And eventually, their personality starts shrinking around the relationship itself. This is why emotionally manipulative dynamics can feel strangely addictive. The nervous system becomes trapped inside cycles of tension and relief. When the manipulator finally returns emotionally, the relief feels powerful, even if the relationship itself remains unhealthy. That emotional relief creates attachment, and the cycle repeats again. Distance, anxiety, reconnection, relief, again and again and again. This pattern is psychologically exhausting because the nervous system never fully relaxes. The brain stays emotionally alert, waiting for the next emotional withdrawal, and eventually the victim stops feeling emotionally safe, even during peaceful moments. Because psychologically, their brain learned that affection can disappear suddenly. That unpredictability changes people deeply. It creates emotional insecurity, overthinking, self-monitoring, fear of abandonment. And maybe the darkest part is that many manipulators never openly admit what they are doing. Sometimes they simply call it needing space, being busy, protecting their peace. And sometimes those explanations are genuine, but manipulative silence feels different. Healthy distance creates clarity. Manipulative distance creates confusion. Healthy communication feels emotionally stable. Manipulative communication keeps you emotionally uncertain, and your nervous system can usually feel that difference long before your mind fully understands it, which leads to an uncomfortable realization. The most powerful manipulation is often invisible, because the control does not happen through force. It happens through emotional conditioning, and once someone learns they can control your emotions through uncertainty, they no longer need to control you directly at all. One of the most important moments in a manipulative relationship is not the beginning. It is the moment you finally recognize the pattern. Because once you clearly see the manipulation, something starts changing psychologically. The silence stops feeling mysterious and starts feeling intentional. You begin realizing that your anxiety was never random. Your nervous system was reacting to emotional instability for a reason. And suddenly, things that once confused you begin making sense. Why you constantly felt emotionally tense. Why you kept over-explaining yourself. Why you felt guilty for expressing normal emotions. Why you became afraid of emotional distance. Because manipulation slowly trains people to abandon themselves emotionally. Not all at once, but gradually, until they start prioritizing emotional survival over emotional honesty. That is the real danger of manipulative silence. It teaches people to disconnect from their own emotional reality, to ignore intuition, to suppress discomfort, to normalize confusion, and eventually, the victim becomes easier to control precisely because they stop trusting themselves. That is why psychological awareness matters so much, because manipulators rely heavily on confusion. Clarity threatens the control. The moment you stop chasing emotional validation, the dynamic begins weakening. The moment you stop over-explaining, the manipulator loses emotional leverage. And the moment you stop treating silence like proof of your worth, the psychological power starts collapsing. Because emotionally healthy relationships do not force you to constantly earn emotional safety. They do not make you afraid of honesty. They do not punish vulnerability with distance. They do not train your nervous system to live in anxiety. Healthy connection feels emotionally stable, not perfect, not conflict-free, but emotionally safe. And maybe that is why so many people stay trapped inside manipulative relationships for years, because they mistake emotional intensity for emotional depth. But anxiety is not love. Confusion is not intimacy. Emotional instability is not passion. Real emotional safety feels calm. And for people conditioned by manipulation, calm can initially feel unfamiliar, sometimes even uncomfortable, because the nervous system became addicted to emotional unpredictability. That is why healing often feels strange at first. There is less chasing, less overthinking, less emotional panic, and slowly, the brain begins learning something it forgot a long time ago. That love should not feel like psychological survival. And maybe the most painful realization comes afterward. The understanding that you spent so much time trying to be understood by someone who benefited from your confusion, but recognizing that truth is not weakness. It is awareness, and awareness changes everything. Because once you truly see emotional manipulation clearly, you stop interpreting silence the same way forever. You stop begging for clarity from people creating confusion intentionally. You stop shrinking yourself emotionally to maintain connection. And for the first time in a long time, you begin protecting your peace instead of protecting the manipulation. Because silence itself was never the real weapon. The real weapon was making you question your own reality. And the moment you stop doubting yourself, the control begins to disappear.